I worked at a small local diner for a year in 2019. It was just a regular restaurant, and I was a server. Every night, the place closed at 10, but my shift ended at 11 because I needed to clean all of the tables in the back room before leaving. It was a typical night of closing alone. I just locked the doors. At 10 p.m., I started wiping down the tables, but after a few seconds, several loud knocks came from the front door, which startled me. But when I looked over, I saw a man standing there, looking through the glass door. I told him loudly that the place was closed for the night. This had happened before, so it wasn't a big deal, but the guy remained there for a few moments, as if he didn't understand what I said. I moved closer to the door. Sorry, the store closed at 10 o'clock. We're not taking any more orders tonight. I spoke louder this time, and I knew he heard me. The guy looked at me for a second without reacting before smiling slightly and turning around to walk away. I assumed he was drunk or something, but after a few minutes I forgot about it and resumed my work. I finished cleaning the tables and began wiping down the front counter. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure moving towards the front door, followed by another knock. It was the same guy as 15 minutes ago, standing right outside, looking through the door at. I'd never had anyone do this before, so I was irritated this time. I raised both arms as in, "What are you doing now?" A kind of gesture. The man, still looking at me, knocked again. I abruptly informed him that we had closed and asked him to leave. This time, however, he appeared irritated by what I had said. He tensed up and gave the door a small push, as if to see if it was locked, before walking away. What the hell is the problem with that? I said aloud to myself as I walked towards the front windows to ensure that he had left the area. I didn't see him anywhere in the parking lot, so I assumed he was gone. Good. I checked the time and was slightly annoyed because it was later than I had hoped, but just as I was about to walk over to the counter, the sudden, loud bang came from the restaurant's back door. I was frozen in fear because I wasn't sure if the back door was locked, but a few seconds later they started hitting it repeatedly. Knowing the door was locked, I knew I had to leave while I still had the chance. I dashed out the front door and grabbed my car, calling the cops as quickly as I could. After a minute or two, I could see through the restaurant window as the man appeared and began to look around the entire building. Then he tried to open the cash register, but I believe he gave up after a few attempts and disappeared to the back of the store. When the cops arrived, they checked to see if the man had left before asking me for the full story. The back door had large dents in it, and the door handle was almost completely gone, clearly having been beaten with a hammer or something. Aside from the tip jar on the front counter, there was little damage or theft. I just find it crazy that some people are willing to do such things for a few extra bucks. Who knows what he would have done if I had been in his way. I spent the majority of my 20s working as a stocker in a variety of stores, essentially putting products on shelves all day. After a few years, however, I accepted a position at a popular pet store that required me to work in multiple locations. Every day, I'd get a small van full of boxes and drive to all of the stores in the area, filling their shelves before returning the van to the warehouse. When I finished, the thing about this job was that I had to pick up the van at 2 p.m. So I wouldn't get out until 12, but most nights it would take much longer, and I'd have to work 1 to 2 hours overtime. This wasn't a big deal for me because, with the overtime, I was making good money, but the shift made it difficult to live a normal life. Anyway, I had been doing it for a few months, and it was just like any other shift. It was 11 p.m., and I was heading to the last store, which meant I wouldn't be back at the warehouse until 1 a.m. Obviously, the pet stores closed at 9, so I was always the only one there. There was a small dock in the back where I could park my van, take my doll out, and roll the boxes in. So I pulled up as usual and unlocked the building's doors. I rolled in 3 large stacks of boxes and began moving each one to the appropriate aisle for the product. I heard a small thud from the storefront. I looked up and stood quietly for a few seconds before returning to work once the noise had subsided. I used to get creeped out when I worked alone in the stores at night, but I've gotten used to it now. When the buildings are quiet, you can hear sounds you don't like, such as the air conditioning turning on and off, so I assumed the noise was just another random sound the building made. I finished unloading the boxes into the aisles and started opening them to stock the product. I was about halfway through and nearly 45 minutes in when I heard the distinct sound of a single cough echoing throughout the building. I froze, staring at the storefront. I could feel my heart racing because I was terrified. Nobody was supposed to be here, and I was confident that if they didn't have bad intentions, they would have said something when I arrived. After nearly a minute, I began to take slow and quiet steps towards the back door. Once I was outside, I shut and locked the door. Feeling much safer now, I got into my van and took out my phone to call 911. As I did so, I heard footsteps rush towards the door from the inside, followed by a slight movement of the door handle. The door was key-locked, so I knew they couldn't open it, but it was still terrifying and caused my adrenaline to spike. Then a loud, harsh banging and possibly kicking came from the other side of the door. The man began yelling and pleading with me to let him out. His voice was filled with anger and rage. I did not respond and rushed to call the cops. While I was on the phone, the man was swearing and cursing, repeatedly hitting the door and aggressively attempting to open it. When the operator announced that the police were on their way, I turned on the van and moved further down, away from the door. I know I should have stayed safe and driven far away, but part of me wanted to make sure. Escape before the police arrive. Thankfully, they arrived quickly. I met them at the door, which was now quiet, and handed over the key. The 3 officers went inside, and a few minutes later they emerged with a man in handcuffs. He was found with a large knife but nothing else. That, I believe, is the most bizarre aspect of this situation. The fact that the man was hiding in a store with a knife and did not steal anything stands out to me the most. I'd never seen this man before. So, I'm not sure why he'd want to harm me, but it appears that's the only explanation. It's scary to think that I could have been only a few feet away from something horrible, but at least I don't have to wonder what his true intentions were. I spent nearly 3 years working overnight at a fast food restaurant. As a drive-through attendant, my college class schedule was unusual and only part-time. Working overnight made it much easier for me to get my schoolwork done during the day. Most of my shifts will be slow and uneventful. However, strange things did happen from time to time. My manager always tried to schedule 2 people overnight, but there were times when we had to spend the night alone. Fortunately, most of the strange things happened with my coworker present, but this one time, I wasn't so fortunate. My main coworker who worked overnights with me was taking a vacation week, so I was alone for 3 of the 5 night shifts that week. My first 2 nights went as usual, without incident. It was slow, and all the drive-through orders were small and straightforward. On the 3rd night, things started slowly, with only 5 to 10 customers arriving every hour to order a small snack or a drink. Then, around 2 a.m., there was a nearly 45-minute period during which no one showed up. I kept my headset on in case someone pulled into the drive-through, but I decided to start cleaning while I had some free time. There wasn't much else to do, so cleaning became my way of passing the time. I'm not sure how long I was cleaning because I was never interrupted, but I passed by the front counter once and noticed bright headlights shining through the store's front window. The car was parked directly outside the doors. Our restaurant's dining room closed at 9 p.m. every night, leaving only the drive-through open, so it was strange that someone was parked there. But of course I didn't think much of it because they could have just parked and looked up directions on their iPhone or something. So I continued my cleaning. A few minutes later, my headset beeped, indicating that a customer was in the drive-through lane. I quickly approached the window and inquired as to how I could. A man spoke softly and asked for a large soda. I instructed him to pull forward and pour his fountain drink as usual. The guy drove up quickly, so I was still pouring the drink, but I noticed in the corner of my eye that he was looking in. Window in the restaurant. Some people did this, but I've never understood why, because it makes things awkward. But I finished up and handed him his drink. He gave me the exact change, and I thanked him before stepping away to continue cleaning. I wiped down a few counters and reorganized a small shelf, but as I walked past the window, I jumped back a little because the man was still there, looking at me. "Did you need anything else, sir?" He didn't respond for a moment, not even to my question, before saying no and driving away. The guy must have been sitting there looking in the window for 5 minutes while I was cleaning, which was creepy and strange, but I knew the restaurant's doors were locked, so I felt somewhat safe. I kept my headset on and proceeded to wipe down the front counters. A few more minutes pass before there's another beep in the headset, But when I got to the computer and asked what they wanted, nobody responded. I asked again and still received no response, so I turned around and looked at the cameras behind me, which were showing live footage of the drive-through line. Strangely, the car drove past the ordering station and came to a stop several feet behind the window. I was standing there. I took a closer look and recognized the car as the man from just a few minutes ago. At this point, I was becoming nervous, so I moved away from the window and stood around the corner. I was out of sight from the window, but I could still see the video. From the camera, I couldn't tell what the guy in the car was doing, but I could see movement. A minute later, the grainy video shows him pulling up quickly and banging on the window. I was startled, but after a few moments he accelerates out of the driveway, through lane, and parks directly in front of the front door. The driver's door swings open, and the man emerges holding something in his hand as he quickly approaches the front door. I grabbed the store phone and dialed 911 as the man aggressively shook the handles, attempting to force the locked doors open. Fortunately, he gave up after a few attempts and ran back to his car, driving away. When the police arrived, they checked to see if I was okay, and I explained what had happened. According to what I heard, they returned in the morning to speak with my manager and collect the camera footage so that they could get a license plate. I wasn't kept up to date on the situation after that, so I'm not sure. Was caught. I've always assumed the man was attempting a robbery, but there's no way of knowing for certain. Sure, being alone that night made me a vulnerable target. Even if many terrible things had occurred, no one would have been present to witness them. Help me. I spend a lot of my free time doing deliveries for DoorDash. It's my way of earning extra money without having to commit to a more demanding second job. I began driving around 9 p.m. on this night and continued to take orders until 11 p.m. when things slowed down slightly. During this time, I simply drove around the shopping center, which housed the majority of the fast food restaurants that people frequently ordered from, until another order arrived. It was a regular order that would be delivered about 4 miles away. After getting the food, I began following the directions to the address, and it was almost immediately clear that it was not a home. I scrolled in on the map, which only showed streets and buildings, and the address was assigned to a street with no buildings. It looked like an empty plot of land, but the DoorDash map was never very good, so I just started driving and decided to check it out and possibly call the customer if there was a problem. This street was bare, there were no houses or crossroads, and no cars were driving down it. When I reached the end, the road turned to gravel, and there was a small wooden sign on the side that was too weathered to read. I pulled onto the gravel and turned on my headlights, and I immediately noticed something far down the road. I drove closer, and my phone alerted me that I had arrived. In my headlights was a small mobile home or RV, with poorly painted numbers on the door. I turned back to my phone 2760. This was the address. I stepped out, holding the food in my hand as I approached the RV, and getting closer. It was slightly unsettling to look at. It was overgrown and old, which was unusual for a mobile home designed to be moved around. I gave it a knock and waited. This was a rare cash order, which made sense once I saw the location, but having this stand here did not make me happy. As I looked around, an unsettling feeling came over me. This location was surrounded by woods with no lights anywhere. Beyond the RV, there was complete darkness. I heard something from inside and was expecting them to open the door, but then a voice to my right startled me. I looked over and saw a man smiling at me from the corner of the RV. He asked if I had his order, and I nodded, apologized, and walked it over to him. I handed it off and calculated the total. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a $5.00 bill before smiling again and saying he only needed to grab the rest. He turned and walked back around the RV while I remained where I was. This entire interaction in writing no longer appears as strange as it once did. But I can tell you there was something seriously wrong with this guy. There was something about the way he acted and said things that gave me chills. I waited for about a minute before becoming nervous and looking around the corner to see where he had gone. In the distance, I saw a figure standing near what appeared to be the dark outline of a shed. They weren't walking. They just stood there. As the fear grew inside me, my head jolted around when I heard the RV door open. A different man looked at me, and as I began to greet him, he slammed the door shut. My heart rate is now increasing. I looked back at the man standing by the shed. He was walking back toward the RV, but he was holding something else. I couldn't tell whether it was a long bat or a rifle. I dashed back to the car, getting in and starting it with shaky hands while shifting into reverse. As I drove away, the man emerged from the side of the mobile home and stood calmly in the darkness. I'm not sure what happened there, but I wasn't interested in finding out. I went straight home and debated calling 911, but I was preoccupied with the fact that I had no idea what was going on. In the end, I regretted not notifying the police. Whatever happened that night will remain as a strange encounter, with no answers as to its true nature. This happened a few weeks ago, and I work at a 24-hour drive-through restaurant. I'm a crew manager, but I mostly just cook and take orders like everyone else. We always have at least 2 people working overnight. One is a manager, and the other is usually a cook. On this particular night, the cook called in sick, and when I asked the others if they could cover his shift, none of them said they could. So by 12 a.m. I was the only worker there. Now, the restaurant usually doesn't get busy overnight, and more employees arrive at 4 a.m., so it wasn't an entire shift alone. But it did mean that I had to do everything myself for 4 hours. I left my headset on in case someone came through the drive-thru and began working on the tasks I had for the night. I began by scraping and cleaning the stovetops, but was interrupted a few minutes later by a banging sound from the front of the restaurant. I walked down and looked over the counter to see a man standing at the front door, banging on it. Then he pressed his face against the glass and looked inside, scanning the entire room before his gaze settled on me. I walked over to the door as he stared at me, and when I got close, he backed up and waited, as if he expected me to open it. Daren't. I yelled through the glass that our dine-in area was closed and that he needed to use the drive-thru to place an order. He seemed perplexed, so I yelled again that the doors were locked and he needed to use the drive-thru. He made no response at the time, leaving me to wonder whether he understood what I was saying. So I turned around and walked back into the kitchen. I figured he'd pick up on the fact that the doors weren't opening eventually. I continued working on the stove tops for at least 15 to 20 minutes. Throughout this time, I had gone to the front to see if the man had left, and from what I could see, he had. The entire parking lot was empty, and the man was not at the door, but I received an alert from my headset a few minutes after finishing with the stoves that someone was in the drive-thru. I turned on my microphone and asked for their order while walking to the window, but no one responded. When I got to the window, I noticed on the camera that there was no car outside. I looked around the screen and saw no movement either, so I ignored it and began walking back. But as I approached the back room, I came to a stop because I thought I heard something. I stood still and listened as footsteps walked slowly above me on the roof of the building. They were careful steps, with only the roof creaking, but I had no doubt that someone was up there. I followed the sound of their footsteps, staring down the ceiling until I saw the ladder leading to the maintenance hatch, at which point I realized what they were doing. I dashed over to the ladder and began looking for some sort of lock to prevent the hatch from opening, but I'd never used it before, so I had no idea how it worked or whether it even locked. Then I heard a loud creak from the ceiling directly above me, followed by a few thuds from outside of the hatch. A moment has passed. The hatch creaked open slightly, and all I saw through the small gap was a pair of eyes staring back at me. I dashed towards the front of the building, hearing loud thuds from where the hatch was. I quickly unlocked the door and dashed toward my car. As I sat inside the restaurant, frantically looking through the windows, I called the police. While on the phone, I noticed a shadow move past the front counter. Then a man appeared, standing in the far back of the restaurant but looking my way. After a moment, he turned and vanished behind the kitchen, leaving me in a panic until the cops arrived. They searched inside and out, including on the roof, but the man had already fled. Nothing from the location was missing either. Neither equipment nor money were taken. Nothing. He simply broke in and left. I tried not to think about it too much, but it's difficult not to believe that he was there for me. As I previously stated, this occurred recently, so there is currently little information available. Despite having his face captured on camera, his identity has yet to be confirmed. The building's owner did, however, add a padlock to the inside of the hatch, which should have been done sooner, but I suppose it was simply an inconvenience. I'm still worried about the man's intentions and whether he's waiting for me to be alone again, ready to do whatever he tried before. Over the last 5 years, I've worked at various odd jobs across the country. I live in a van, so I travel a lot, but a few months of the year I have to stay in one place for an extended period of time in order to save money before moving on. At the time, I was living in Utah's Mid-East region and working at the gas station. It was situated on a road that was primarily used by locals to travel in and out of state without having to deal with highway congestion. There was nothing else along this route. It was just a road with a single gas station for the occasional driver to stop at. That's why it was ideal for me the location didn't matter. Because I lived in a van, I could easily stay out there for extended periods of time while working. Anyway, I'd been there for a little more than a month and I was still working random shifts. Today I worked from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. It wasn't a particularly special night. There were no customers aside from a few pump stops, and there wasn't much to do in terms of stocking or anything else. I was mostly standing around on my phone or pacing around the store, making sure the shelves looked good. Then, at 1 a.m., a customer drove into the station and parked in one of the few spaces directly in front of the door. I returned to the counter, knowing they were on their way in. A man got out and entered the shop, looking over and smiling at me before nodding as he turned down one of the aisles. He began whistling as he examined a few items, picking them up and returning them before moving down the aisle and repeating the process. I wasn't sure if he was just taking a break from driving or if he needed something, but the items he was picking up and looking at were all different, and he didn't appear to be interested in purchasing them. Then he abruptly stopped whistling, walked over to the door, and departed. I didn't think he stole anything, but it seemed strange. He got into his car and began moving around, reaching into the back seat before exiting and returning to the shop. After realizing I wasn't feeling very comfortable, this seemed almost exactly how I imagined an armed robbery would begin, but the aggression I expected when he returned didn't materialize. He approached the counter and inquired about how my night had begun, a quick exchange of small talk. I tried to act normally, just in case I was overthinking things. But then he asked if I could help. He has his car. He stated that his tires needed air and that he did not see any pumps outside. There were no self-service air pumps available at this station. However, we did have a handheld air compressor for emergency situations. I pulled it out and followed him to his car. He pointed down to the tire that needed it, and I dove in, inserting the compressor line. I walked in for less than 10 seconds before the pressure was detected to be at the appropriate level. I looked over and saw the man looking down at me with no expression. I took everything out, stood up, and began walking back to the shop. When he stopped me by rushing in front of the door, his right hand was deep inside his jacket pocket, and he stared at me with a cold expression. I told him to move, but he remained in front of the door, indicating that he was about to do something. I took a step back, trying to say something to defuse the situation, but just as I thought he was about to snap, he ran around me and got into his car, pulling out aggressively and speeding away. I took this opportunity to go inside and call 911, and they arrived surprisingly quickly. I arrived only minutes later. They were already on the chase, looking for the exact vehicle the man drove. The officer stated that the man was on the run from a recent crime near the border. They didn't give me any details, but the way they said it made me believe it wasn't a minor robbery. They resumed their journey after my brief statement, and I received no further updates. I tried looking up recent crimes and other information, but I couldn't find anything useful. I'm not sure what he was up to or why he stopped at the station, but my best guess was that he was going to steal my van and cover his tracks, or at least delay them. However, depending on the crime he had just committed, I believe my life could have been in danger, which is why he chose. It is unknown what will happen if nothing is done to me. I work at a Montessori school, which has small classrooms of 3 to 4 children each. The classrooms are on the lower level of a church, and my responsibility is to clean them. Every night after classes, it would only take me about 2 hours to clean all of the rooms, but I also worked the closing shift at a nearby grocery store, so I wouldn't arrive at school until around 10:30 p.m. most nights. You should also know that the church shared a parking lot with an elderly care facility directly across from it. I'll admit that a lot of strange and creepy things have happened at this school, but the weirdest had to be what happened a few weeks ago. I had just finished cleaning the second room and was preparing to move all of my cleaning supplies to the third room. It was probably around 11:45 at this point, which meant I was running a little late, so I was rushing. As I crossed the hallway to the third room, I could hear loud bells ringing throughout the church upstairs. Someone rang the doorbell. Nobody had ever shown up for any of my shifts before because it was always so late, and both the school and the church had been closed hours before. I was a little nervous, so I moved slowly up the stairs and towards the door. It was one of those wooden doors with large, tinted glass windows. Trying not to be noticed, I checked around the corner to see who was outside. I noticed an elderly woman, probably in her 70s or 80s, standing just outside the door. I backed away before she could see me. I decided to ignore it, assuming she had wandered off and that one of the attendants at the old people's home would pick her up. I started cleaning again, this time mopping the room's floors. But only a few minutes later I heard banging in the halls. I jumped a little then. Then I stopped listening. The banging paused for a few seconds, followed by the old lady yelling from outside. It was difficult to understand what she was saying, so I went back upstairs where I could clearly hear what she was asking for. She was looking for someone named Abby. She kept repeating her name. As I approached the door, the woman paused. I looked around the corner, and she was no longer outside the door. It was a little unsettling, but I reminded myself that someone had probably come to get her after hearing her yell. I turned around and started making my way back out of the corner of my eye. I see the old lady staring at me through the window next to the stairs. She looked me in the eyes and yelled, "Abby, help me." Her eyes were wide open, and her hair was long and gray. I ran back downstairs and locked myself in one of the classrooms. I took out my phone and called the elderly couple next door, explaining the situation and wondering if she had wandered away from them. The lady on the line informed me that everyone was present, and they would have noticed if anyone had left because they were required to check out. She stated that she would double check with security and remain on the line just in case. While I was waiting, I heard a banging on the upstairs window, and a few seconds later, the woman on the phone described the old lady's features and asked if it was her. I said yes and mentioned that she is constantly yelling for someone named. There was a brief moment of silence, ma'am. I spoke softly back into the phone and she warned me not to approach her and to find a safe place to stay until someone could come and get her. Obviously, this only made me more terrified. I remained in the room, listening to the repeated banging on the window upstairs. Now, this was an old building, and I wasn't sure how long those windows would last if she kept banging on them. I eventually heard male voices outside, and after what sounded like a struggle, they left. I sat there for a few minutes, just reflecting on what had happened. Then I got up to finish cleaning the rooms. The entire situation felt surreal, and the fact that the old lady is in the building across from me still makes me nervous. I never found out who Abby was or why the lady tried to enter the church, but I'm glad I didn't open the door. I used to work the register at a local gas station, but I left after a series of strange events occurred while I was working overnight. But this one incident will stay with me forever. I only worked the night shift a few days per week, usually Friday and Saturday. My shifts were usually boring, and it was a game of trying to stay awake. The only thing I had to do was stock the shelves and occasionally assist customers. On road trips, I would encounter a large number of drunk people or families, as well as entire groups of friends. But for the most part, things were quiet. On this particular night, it was around 2 a.m. and I hadn't had a customer in over an hour, so I was beginning to doze off. The desk was around the corner from the entrance, and there was a bell on the door that rang whenever someone walked in, so usually falling asleep was not a big deal. I awoke after hearing the bell ring, and a few seconds later, I noticed a customer walk in. He resembled a typical 30-year-old man who would stop in for a beer or a snack. He took a short walk down each aisle, taking in everything. Now, I've worked in retail for a long time and know what it's like when someone is looking for something specific. But this man had no idea. He was simply looking at the shelves and browsing the store. This is normal during the day, but people rarely come in at 2 a.m. to browse the gas station shelves. I looked out the window to my left to see if he was filling up his car or simply passing the time. After a few minutes, he looked over at me, said thank you, and walked out. I wasn't sure what to make of that, but I assumed he stole something small and was just being himself. After a few minutes, I forgot about the situation and began to feel tired again. To pass the time, I grabbed my inventory card and began stocking the shelves. I'm not sure how long I was stocking, maybe 20 minutes, before I noticed a man approaching the end of the aisle I was stocking. I was startled because I had never heard the doorbell ring before. He was dressed in dark clothing and a large hoodie. I could tell right away that something was off. The man continued down to the back of the store, and I quickly returned to behind the counter. I tried not to stare, but as he walked down the aisles, he didn't seem to be looking for anything. He was simply browsing. It occurred to me right away that this was the same guy from a short time ago, but he had changed clothes for some reason. I also realized that he probably came to check out the place before doing whatever he planned to do. I started panicking in my head. The man began to walk down the aisle closest to the counter, and I noticed something heavy in his front hoodie pocket. I made a split-second decision to speak in order to prevent further escalation. "Do you need help finding something?" He made eye contact with me, and I could tell he understood what I was trying to do. He approached the counter without saying a word. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small handgun. Then he took a small pack of gum from beside the counter and put it in front of me. He simply stated. I didn't react for a few seconds, confused and shocked by what was happening, before nervously scanning the gum. Still holding the gun, he removed $1 from his jean pocket, threw it on the counter, thanked, and walked away. I was in complete shock, trying to process what had just happened. I ended up reporting the incident to the police and calling my manager, who did not answer. There were no updates on the situation, but it kept me on edge for the final few months I worked there. I'm still not sure what happened that night or what the man's intentions were, but I'm glad I didn't find out. I work as a cybersecurity analyst for a large office company in my hometown. I had recently started my first job in the field, so I had to work the shift when no one else wanted to. Working overnight wasn't as bad as I expected, and it was peaceful. My job primarily consisted of reviewing log files to ensure that nothing suspicious occurred while the rest of the crew slept. This meant that I was usually alone in the office building for several hours. I'd fall asleep frequently because staring at a screen for hours on end in the middle of the night was difficult on my eyes, and with no one to keep me company, staying awake wasn't easy. I began setting soft alarms on my phone for every hour to ensure that I did not sleep through my entire shift. It was a typical night, and my coworker had just finished his shift at 12 and left the building. A few minutes later, I got up and started the coffee machine before walking down the main hallway to see if anyone else was still in the building. This was my usual routine, just to make myself more comfortable. I returned to my desk, set alarms on my phone, and resumed work. It was about 20 minutes later that I realized I hadn't heard the coffee machine beep, indicating that it was finished, and went to check on it. I walked down the hall to the small coffee desk and discovered that there was no coffee in the pot, and that the entire coffee machine had been turned off. I thought it was strange, but that was about it, and I simply turned it back on and returned to my desk. As soon as I sat down, I realized my phone was not where I had left it on the desk. I checked my pockets and dashed back to the coffee desk, but it was also missing. I replayed it in my head and knew for certain that I had placed it right on my desk, next to my keyboard. I started to freak out and looked around frantically. My desk was set up in the center of a large room with other desks and computers. I felt watched as I stood in the middle, knowing that someone else had to be there with me. Nervously, I called out to my friend in a shaky voice, hoping it was just him playing a silly prank on me. I waited a few seconds, but there was no response. I stood by my desk for a few seconds before hearing a soft shuffling from behind the desk in the far corner. Almost immediately after my phone alarm went off in the opposite corner of the room, my first thought was that there were probably 2 unknown strangers in the room with me. I started running for the door outside the building. I didn't hear any footsteps behind me as I walked out, but I wasn't taking any chances. I dashed across the street to a nearby gas station and called 911 from their phone to report the unknown people in our office building. The police arrived quicker than I expected and searched the building. They brought out a man after a few minutes, but I didn't recognize him. They also found my phone behind some boxes in the corner of the office. He was also found carrying a small knife in his pocket. The next day, we learned a lot more about what really happened. Apparently, the man was an old employee who had been fired shortly before I began working there. The man told the cops he was trying to scare me into leaving the building so he could reclaim his company laptop. Apparently, he obtained the information he desired from it. At least that was what he claimed. It all seemed strange to me, and I'm not sure if I trusted his reasoning for breaking in, but my coworkers did mention that they remembered the guy, and he was definitely strange. I'm glad I got out of there when I did, because I don't know what would have happened if his plan hadn't worked and I stayed in the building. Toward the end of my high school career, I delivered for a well-known fast food restaurant in my town. My friends all had jobs there, but they purposefully scheduled us on different shifts to keep us from slacking off. It ruined the fun, but the money was still nice to have. Usually I don't have any interesting stories about my workdays, but this one night was an exception. It was the weekend, and I was scheduled to work until 10 o'clock. The orders were coming in steadily, so I was making deliveries one after the other, going in, picking up the bag, driving to the house, and repeating the process indefinitely. I believe I received this order around 9 a.m., but I can't be certain because I was mindlessly running deliveries at the time. I got the bag, pulled up the GPS location for the address, and began driving. Halfway through the drive, I realized I was going in a different direction than usual. I had been this way before, but there weren't many houses over here, so most orders would go in the opposite direction. I drove without thinking much about it until I noticed on the GPS that I was 1 minute away. Looking around, I couldn't think of a single place that was only a minute away. There were no houses or shops, just trees and a road. Literally nothing. Regardless, I drove until the GPS indicated I'd arrived, which was only a quarter mile further down. I pulled off to the side and took a quick look around to see if I had missed anything. I then called the customer. The phone rang for a while before they answered it. "Hello, I drove to the address you provided, but it does not appear to be correct. Could you please confirm this address?" I inquired, hoping he had simply made a typo. He repeated the address to me, but it was identical to the one I had in my GPS. Then he said something I did not expect. "Wait, I believe I see." I looked up and down the street. There was someone waving to me. I drove up beside him, but I had a bad feeling in my stomach. I rolled down the window, and he immediately began apologizing, saying the address was difficult to find. He sometimes pointed behind him, indicating that his house was down that road. This road he was referring to resembled a half-beaten dirt walking trail that led through the forest. I smiled and said it was fine, handing him the bag through the window. He smiled back and thanked me, watching me pull back onto the road and make a U-turn. When I looked in my mirror and saw the man still standing on the side of the road, I thought how strange that was. But not even a minute into the drive, something began to feel off. My car was bumpy and leaning to the right, and it was only getting worse by the second. It began to feel dangerous to drive, so I had to pull over. I called for roadside assistance first. I wasn't sure what was wrong or if it had anything to do with that man, but, as I previously stated, I had a bad gut feeling and wasn't taking any chances. After I got off the phone with them, I got out and checked my tires. My front right tire was busted, and it was the one closest to where the man stood, so I quickly added 2 and 2 together. I looked back down the road, and in the distance, I saw a figure approaching me. I quickly got into my car and locked the doors. He approached slowly, probably aware of the exact situation I was in. As the man approached, I considered whether I should risk driving on my busted tire. But, miraculously, a truck came down the road and stopped behind me. They got out and asked if I was okay. I noticed the man walking quickly back the way he came. I took this opportunity to inform the man in the truck of my suspicions, and he remained with me until the roadside assistance truck arrived, which was only a minute later. I called the cops, and I wasn't surprised to learn that the man ordered from a fake name and address. I'm not sure what he was trying to accomplish, but he had me drive all the way out on an empty road. Hidden by the forest, I suspect it was more than a robbery. When I was 17, I worked at my parents' local restaurant. We were never in a busy environment, but it was enough to get by. I worked the cash register and occasionally assisted with waiting tables and cleaning. My parents were nice enough to give me flexible hours whenever I needed them for school or whatever. Over the summer, however, I would work full 40-hour weeks, usually from the afternoon until closing. This was my second year working there, and during the last half of the summer, my parents assigned me to do the closing tasks for most nights. I'd be there for about 15 to 30 minutes after restaurant hours to count money and clean up. It wasn't difficult, but it was a small amount of extra responsibility. Anyway, this Friday night, my father and I had a busier night than usual. Except for the assistant cook, we were the only two workers there. After closing, my father assisted me for a few minutes before locking the front doors and leaving for the night. I had plans with a friend after work, so I was rushing to finish everything. I finished a few minutes after 11. I walked out the back door, which led to a small employee parking lot, but I was surprised when I saw a guy right next to my car. He was looking through my windows, as if he wanted to see what was inside. He looked over at me briefly before disappearing into the trees behind the parking lot. I didn't have enough time to get a good look at him, but the only thing I noticed was his long, unkempt, and patchy beard. He was a strange-looking guy, and I felt uneasy as I drove away. A few days had passed, and this night it was just me and the assistant cook working the closing shift. It was a weekday, so business was slow, but about 20 minutes before closing, a man walked through the door. He sat at a table and said nothing. This was one of those restaurants where you went up to the register first to order before sitting down. So, this was kind of strange. After a few minutes, I approached his table and asked if he wanted to order anything before we closed. When I saw his long, patchy beard, I recognized him as the guy from the other night. I was so caught up in my thoughts that I missed his response. I tried to tell him to leave, but I stuttered and spoke with no confidence or assertiveness. He looked me in the eyes and asked for a dark roast coffee, ignoring everything I said. I turned around and placed the order. I assumed it was all a misunderstanding, but I'm pretty sure it was just me lying to myself to make myself feel less afraid of him. He sat at the table and stared ahead until his coffee was ready. I walked over to him and reminded him that the place was closing in 10 minutes, so he needed to leave soon. Of course, he did not respond, so I stepped away. I approached the assistant cook, with whom I had never spoken before, and told him about this guy and the uneasy feelings I had toward him. He patted my shoulder and told me to get started on cleaning for him. Then he moved to the front. I watched from over the counter as he politely told the man to leave. The man got up and made a brief eye contact with me from across the restaurant before turning around and walking to the door. I watched him leave, and as he extended his arm to push the door open, a very recognizable object emerged. A gun was tucked into the back of his belt. I thanked the cook and explained everything in greater detail so he could understand my concerns. He called the cops without hesitation, and while they couldn't find the guy, he never returned to the restaurant. I'm grateful to our assistant cook, who I'll keep anonymous for his own privacy. He could have easily left for the night, leaving me to deal with my own problems, but his kindness most likely saved my life that night. Last year, I began a new job at a grocery store doing overnight stocking. This was a local chain store with about a dozen locations, but the stores weren't particularly large. Most nights, we'd have a team of 2 or 3 stockers preparing the store for the following day. I'd worked at a few stores prior to this, so I wasn't unfamiliar with the overnight stocking gig. On this particular night, I arrived at work at 10 p.m., only to discover that one of the guys had called off. So it would just be me and my manager, Yuri, for the night. Yuri was cool, but he didn't say much, which made for a boring shift. But then, an hour later, I was working in the chip aisle when Yuri suddenly appeared in front of me, looking concerned. "Is everything okay?" I asked, pulling out my earbuds. He was breathing heavily and asked if I saw anyone in the store. I declined, and he explained that he thought he saw someone walk past his aisle a minute ago, but when he went to check, there was no one there. I could tell he was nervous, but he tried to dismiss it and returned to work. After he left, I reflected on how that was the most I'd ever talked to him, which made me wonder if he saw something. I paid more attention, but the next 3 hours were uneventful, and everything faded from my mind. We stocked separate aisles and never saw each other. Around 2:00 a.m., I'd finished all of the work he'd assigned me for the night. So I went to ask him what to do next. I walked through each aisle until I reached the end of the store, then returned and double-checked every aisle. but he wasn't there. I looked in both the back warehouse and the office but couldn't find him. I assumed he was in the bathroom or taking a break in his car, so I found some work to keep me busy for 15 minutes before walking around the entire store again, looking for him. All I found was his carton in the aisle. It was a cart. I saw him with him at the start of our shift, and it appeared that he'd stocked half of the boxes, but never finished the rest. When I saw that, I became nervous. I went out the front doors and searched the parking lot for him. His vehicle was in the far back, near mine, but it was empty. I even measured the size of the structure to see if he was taking a cigarette break. It had been nearly 4 hours since I last saw him, and I became so concerned that I called the police. The police needed to contact the store director to obtain the CCTV camera codes. They then replayed the nights. I told them about the time he approached me to ask about the person he had seen, and when we rewinded, we saw someone walking through the store. They were careful, hiding, and making no noise. But yes, he was correct. Someone else was present. We watched more, and about 30 minutes after you spoke with me, this unknown man approached him and held Yuri at gunpoint. It was extremely disturbing to watch, and knowing I was only a few miles away with no idea made me feel sick. The man forced Yuri to walk, most likely threatening him to remain silent. He led him out to the back of the building, where he was pushed into a car and driven off. According to the police, it appears that the two of them knew each other and that this was a personal attack. The man was never identified, and Yuri is still missing. Even though the police were certain it was a personal attack, I didn't take any chances and quit that job a few weeks later, but I don't think I'll ever get over the events of that terrifying night. In my 20s, I got a job as a storage worker at a local warehouse. It was located on the side of a highway near the town's end. To nothing, we always joked about the location and why the company's owners decided to build such a large warehouse in a remote, empty area of town, away from everything. It was probably just cheap land with easy access from the highway, but it always felt strange to be pulled into a large empty parking lot in the middle of nowhere each night. I always worked overnight shifts with one of my coworkers while remaining anonymous and calling him Tyler. Our job was to disassemble and organize the day's shipments before transporting them to their designated storage areas in the warehouse. After a few weeks, it becomes extremely repetitive. Most nights I do easy work while still half asleep. Tyler and I were the only two overnight workers, so we would spend some days working alone. This occurred during Tyler's vacation week, so I was alone at the warehouse from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. every night. It was Wednesday night, and something strange happened right away. When I arrived, a car was parked in the far corner of this large, empty parking lot. Its lights were turned off, and no one appeared to be around it. But being all the way out here on private property was very suspicious. I parked near the entrance door and went inside before calling the cops to come down and have a look. I assumed it was just some teenagers or a broken-down car from the highway, but it was on private property and parked in the far corner, which gave me a strange feeling. 20 minutes later, cops arrived at the front door and informed me that the car was empty, with no sign of anyone. They were pretty sure it was broken down too, so we called a tow truck to come down and take it away. And then I went back to work. I moved several shipments, which probably took me about an hour, before being interrupted by a loud bang at the entrance to the building. I quickly walked down, turned on the front lights, and then approached the door. A man stood behind the glass, staring at me with his fist on the door, and he appeared very tired and exhausted. I moved closer and spoke through the glass. "Are you okay? What are you doing here? This is private property." The man stared at me with disgust. "Where is my car?" he yelled, pounding on the door. I tried to explain, but he kept interrupting me and becoming increasingly aggressive, screaming at me to let him inside the building. I threatened to call the cops on him, which finally got him to quiet down. He backed up and gave me another crazy look before walking away. As I returned to work, I couldn't stop thinking about where that man might have been. All this time, I assumed he went to a gas station to get a canister for his car, but he couldn't have walked all the way there and back, and if he had gotten a ride, he would have arrived back before the car was towed. I couldn't think of where the man could have been. That would only make sense after a few minutes of working again. Another bang echoed from the front door. I was frustrated and scared, but when I looked through the glass, I didn't expect to see the same cops who had been here before. They stated that they received a call from the tow company regarding some concerning items on the outside of the trunk that I assume no one noticed beforehand. They questioned me about everything I saw, and I told them about the man who had stopped by looking for his car. They left soon after, and I didn't get any real updates until later in the week, when the cops returned with search dogs to search the forest surrounding the warehouse. They said they found dried blood on the back of the bumper, and when they got a warrant to search it, they discovered even more blood inside the trunk. They believe the man may have come out to bury a body in the forest near the warehouse, but they have never discovered any significant evidence. However, the man never returned to claim his car from the tow company, and he never appeared again. He just vanished. It's terrifying to realize how close I was to a possible murderer. And for the last couple of years working at the warehouse, I'd get extremely creeped out when working nights alone. I knew it wasn't likely, but the possibility of the man returning and attempting to make me pay for what I had done lingered in my mind. I was doing DoorDash late one night to earn some extra cash for savings. It wasn't too busy, but I was getting a few orders here and there, which made it worthwhile. A little after 1 a.m., an order arrived for a customer 30 minutes away. It was a long drive, but the compensation was sufficient for me to accept it. I drove to the restaurant, a local Korean establishment that appeared to be expensive, and then began my journey home. By the end of the route, it was taking me through a bad part of town. I'd been here before and had no problems, but as I drove through and saw all the dilapidated houses, I became uncomfortable. When I arrived at the address, I parked along the side of the road. The house was very small and old, with a cracked and destroyed driveway. I got out of my car and started walking up to the porch, carrying the bag. My phone rang just as I was about to set the bag down. I said hello but received no response, so I hung up and quickly completed the delivery before hurrying back to my car. As I started my car and buckled up, I heard the front door of the house swing open. I looked over and saw a woman waving her arms in the air and running toward my car, screaming for me to wait. It was extremely bizarre. I was too frozen to respond. She dashed up to my window and banged on it, pleading with me to help her. I still had no idea what was going on, so I opened the window slightly and asked what she needed. She told me that her 3-year-old daughter was inside, struggling to breathe, and that I needed to help her. The woman began walking back up the driveway, pleading with me to come help her. Still in shock, I got out of my car and began to follow her, but as I did so, I noticed her becoming quieter and less panicked. I began to think more clearly now that the situation was less chaotic and unexpected, realizing how unusual this was. "Have you called 911 yet?" I inquired, stopping in the driveway. When she turned around, her tears and panic seemed to have disappeared. She stated that there was no time and resumed her obvious panic. It seemed more like a performance than genuine distress. I dashed back to my car as she screamed, even running down the driveway to try to open the passenger door. I restarted the car and reversed as she attempted to run in front of it to get to my side. Once I was clear, I put it in drive and drove around her. And the second I passed the house again, I noticed a large figure standing in the upstairs window, watching everything. As soon as I left the neighborhood, I called 911 and reported the address and situation. When I received a call back from the police, they informed me that the woman had a different story, claiming she had only come out to give me a cash tip. They also mentioned that she lived alone, with no record of any children or adults living with her. This only added to my horror at the situation, but after speaking with the officer again, it became clear that nothing could be done. There was no evidence to support either of our claims, and attempting to press charges would be pointless. Furthermore, the officer appeared tired and uninterested in dealing with anything, but I knew he was correct about my inability to do much, so it was left at that. In my gut, I knew she was trying to get me inside the house for sinister reasons, especially since she didn't have any children. What is the scariest part? After knowing everything, it was strange to see that person inside the house watching us and waiting for me to enter. I worked at a 24-hour fast food restaurant a few years ago while in college. The job was not fun or enjoyable in any way, and the majority of my coworkers were middle-aged people with no personality. I was doing school online, which gave me more time to work, so I was putting in at least 40 hours per week and even got promoted to shift. lead after a few months. When I accepted the promotion, I had no idea that I was signing up to become a full-time employee, which meant that they could force me to work any shift, even if I was only a week in. They put me up overnight, and I couldn't argue. Overnights were a pain because I was always the only one there. So, if the drive-thru was backed up, then I'd be hustling non-stop without taking breaks. On the other hand, sometimes it would be completely dead, and I'd be standing around all night with my phone. This was one of those nights when I was sitting on a pile of boxes in the back of the kitchen, scrolling through my phone, trying to pass the time, when my headset rang to alert me that a customer had arrived at the drive-thru. I got up, went to the computer, and asked what they would do. I like to order. Nobody said anything, so I turned and looked up at the drive-thru camera, which showed an empty lane. There are no cars in the drive-thru or parking lots surrounding the restaurant. However, the system never falsely beeps like that. There was a slight storm outside, so I assumed it was a raindrop or a flash of light. You must have triggered the sensor somehow. I stayed by the drive-thru window for a few minutes before my headset beeped again. This time, I quickly checked the cameras and saw a man walking past the drive-thru lane. He was dressed in a thick hoodie and a face covering, but he quickly walked out of the camera's view. He couldn't have parked or walked anywhere else near the restaurant unless he walked on the side of the main road. I checked the cameras to see if he'd return, but after 10 minutes of nothing, I went back to my phone. I waited 15 minutes before getting another beat, and when I checked the cameras, I saw the same man, but this time he was standing in the drive-thru. "Lane, can I assist you, sir?" After a moment, he began to recite an order for a small meal. I was not supposed to serve people in the drive-thru unless they were in a vehicle, so I told him I couldn't take his order. He stood there, letting the rain soak him while staring at the screen and not speaking. I considered telling him to leave, but I didn't want to escalate the situation if it wasn't necessary, so I waited. After a minute, he began walking down the drive-thru lane toward the restaurant's window. I rushed over and closed the window, and the man appeared outside in an instant. He was still wearing his hood and mask, but he appeared to be in his late 40s, with long black hair and dead eyes. He watched me through the window and stood outside, as if waiting for me to speak to him. Something about his expression terrified me and prevented me from speaking. Then he softly said, "Open." I nervously replied no, and Justice remained where I was as the man continued to look at me. He asked again and knocked on the window, but after a few seconds he turned and walked away, leaving a loud scraping sound along the side of the building. I checked the cameras to make sure he left, and thankfully he did not return. During the next hour of my shift, however, I kept thinking about that scraping sound. I decided to take the trash to the dumpster and have a quick look. A long scratch on the side of the wall, under the drive-thru window, appeared to be caused by dragging a knife along the building. I called the cops, but the man couldn't be identified from the grainy camera footage, which was masked by the heavy rain and fog. The man never showed up, and I'll never know what he planned to do that night. But given that he was holding a knife, I assumed that if I had followed his orders and opened that window, it would have been the last thing I ever did.